Such as?
Rectal electroshock.
Sorry, they were electrocuting you.
Right.
Up your bottom?
Yes.
Quello di oggi è un episodio più torbido e delicato del solito. Esamineremo alcune dichiarazioni che riteniamo particolarmente interessanti, alcune recenti e altre meno, ma tutte capaci di aggiungere nuovi indizi alla nostra indagine, che prosegue ormai da 4 anni. Data la natura dei temi trattati, questo episodio non è destinato a un pubblico giovane, niente bimbi quindi. Vi ricordiamo inoltre che potete seguire le news in tempo reale sul nostro canale WhatsApp Intermundia. Iniziamo con la testimonianza di un sopravvissuto alle torture subite nell'ambito di presunti programmi della CIA dedicati allo studio delle capacità paranormali. Secondo il suo racconto, quest'uomo sarebbe stato osservato, analizzato e torturato per 8 anni, dai 4 agli 11 anni di età, come vittima presumibilmente del programma MK Ultra. Questa testimonianza è importante per cogliere fino a che punto alcuni apparati statunitensi sarebbero arrivati nello studio di questi fenomeni. Da qui si può forse comprendere meglio anche la grande difficoltà degli Stati Uniti nel confrontarsi apertamente con il tema della disclosure e con la possibilità di raccontare tutta la verità. Allo stesso tempo emerge l'impressione che si tratti di una questione soprattutto americana e forse anche per questo motivo in Europa se ne parla ancora poco o quasi per nulla.
So many people have contacted me about anomalous experiences in the GATE program. I want to take you through this very carefully and very slowly.
Okay.
Why were you being taken to this facility at all? What was the reason, the stated reason for you being sent there?
Well, the facility itself sat underneath of a pediatric clinic. And I would essentially go from the pediatric clinic via an elevator type of transport into the facility, and they never specifically stated a reason. There were just a series of, procedures, and you could say tests.
And were your mom or your dad or any relative with you when you went to this facility?
No. My grandmother would take me to my appointments. She would wait in the waiting room. I would go back to the appointment, and from there...
So you'd go into the pediatrician's office?
Correct.
And what would happen then?
I would essentially... Sometimes I would go back directly to the elevator. Sometimes I would have to wait. And then I would go...
Did anyone at any stage make any reference to you having abilities or something about you that they were taking an interest in?
Yeah, vaguely.
What happened?
They would do a series of tests.
What sort of tests?
Typical Zener card
So
tests.
the Zener cards are tests essentially for psychic ability.
Yes.
So they'd ask you to try and see what the symbol was on a card.
Right.
Were you able to pick the symbol?
Sometimes, yeah.
How often?
75%.
Do you think they knew about your precog abilities before you came to the centre?
I believe so.
And do you think that's connected to your grandfather and his military service?
I believe so, but I don't have any evidence to confirm it. But that is the only logical explanation I can think of.
Who was the treating pediatrician?
Dr. Cole.
Did he ever talk to you about these abilities?
No.
Did he give you any of the tests that you were given?
No, he was never present in the facility underground. He was always operating out of the pediatric center.
And did you ever actually go to him for any real civilian type of treatment?
I did. He was working as a legitimate pediatrician.
So you were a very small little boy at this time, 4 years old.
Yeah, approximately 4 or 5 to 9, 10, right in there.
So your granny would take you into the waiting room at the pediatrician's office.
Mm-hmm.
Who would come and get you?
Usually a nurse would come and call me back, and I'd walk. The nurse would escort me to the elevator or to a separate room to wait in if I had to wait.
So your granny wasn't aware that you were being taken somewhere else?
No, she wasn't.
Was it ever explained to you where you were being taken?
No, there was an escort, a guy in a typical suit that would meet me down below.
How many floors would the lift go down? Was it deep?
It was deep. It was deep. But also, there were some shallower tunnels that went to other locations, such as the hospital.
How far did you walk?
Sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes 15 minutes.
Because the Lewis McChord Army Base is about 15 miles distance from the hospital where you were.
It is.
You don't believe you were taken to the Army Base?
I don't. I recall asking one time where we were in relation to what was above ground, and it was actually miles west of the pediatric facility.
So you were walking a great distance?
Yeah.
And were you put into any kind of transport when you were underground?
There was one time we were in a kind of almost like a train shuttle type of situation, and that was a little bit different than the what was typical, what was standard.
And how long did the train shuttle go for?
Not more than 15, 20 minutes.
Which would be consistent with taking you to the local gigantic army base at Lewis McChord, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So I don't want to upset you, but I want to go back to the electric shocks that you were given. Describe the pain.
Paralyzing. I mean, it felt like my veins or my nerves were like lightning was shooting through my body.
Did you cry?
No, I couldn't cry.
Why?
You almost go beyond that stage of being, like, after it was over I did, but the pain was so intense that, yeah, it's hard to explain.
What were they saying to you while they were giving you the shocks?
Well, there was the instance while they were, or the situation where they would ask me questions, and it was the only thing that they would say to me were the only thing they would talk about were the questions, basically. But as far as the other stuff goes, when it wasn't in that situation, they didn't really talk to me.
You've described one experiment to me when we were off camera where a glyph or a symbol was stuck on a wall. Tell me about that.
There were a couple different times where I'd be placed in a room and asked to look at a glyph, look at a symbol.
What was the symbol?
I would say it's almost like a combination, like something along the lines of a Celtic rune, but mixed with like something that was Egyptian.
What would happen when you looked at that symbol?
Well, there were certain instances where I almost felt like there was some presence there, something associated with that symbol that was attached to it.
What, some kind of intelligence?
Yeah.
Was there somebody else in the room with you when you were looking at that symbol in the room?
No.
Was there something on the table?
No, nothing on the table.
How many different types of glyphs were you shown? Just the one or others?
I think there were about 3.
And what would they tell you to do?
There was another instance when they did the same sort of thing, except they asked me to like almost allow whatever it was that presence to like allow it inside of me. And
did you do that?
I did.
What did you feel when you did that?
I felt electric. I mean, I felt at the time it felt amazing, but also like terrible. Like it felt, I don't know how to describe it. It's almost like if you you're in a room and somebody turns up the TV really, really loud, and you can't think, and the only thing that's present is that noise, that static, the chaos coming from the television set. That's almost what it felt like in my mind.
Did you ever find yourself going out of body? Did you ever have those experiences of leaving your body?
Yeah, during the electroshock stuff.
What happened?
Usually, this would happen quite frequently. I would, after, almost initially, within seconds.
How would you leave your body?
I wouldn't remember actually leaving it. I would just almost wake up above my body.
So you'd see your body down below you?
Yeah.
And how many times would they give you shocks while you were in these facilities, in this particular session? One time, 2 times?
No, sometimes 5 times, 10 times.
And how long would they let the shocks last for?
It depends. I mean, the more intense it was, the shorter the shock, the less intense, the longer it would last. Sometimes up, I think.
Did you ever confront the pediatrician who was supposedly treating you about this underground facility?
I did not, no.
Why not?
I didn't really know what to say to him. Don't really know how to broach that subject.
Did anyone ever tell you not to speak about what was going on?
The people that worked down there, obviously, and
how would they say that?
Basically, they would just say that you can't talk about what we do down here, and if I did, there would be consequences. It would be bad for you, or it could be bad for your family. Well, there were some pretty invasive procedures.
Such as?
Rectal electroshock.
Sorry, they were electrocuting you?
Right.
Up your bottom?
Yes.
So describe that to me.
Well, it would occur in a couple of different situations. There were certain times when I would essentially be in either like a seated position or almost like a semi-leaning back position, and there wasn't really anything else going on but that.
Were you strapped into a chair or anything? Were they forcibly restraining you?
Yes.
How did they do that?
I'd change out of my clothes and they'd put me in a gown. They'd strap me down to a chair that kind of had obviously didn't have a bottom and to it, and then they'd strap my arms down and my legs down. And
I'm sorry, as you're describing this to me, you're 100% that this happened to you.
Yes.
So, but you only recalled this in your 30s.
I did. And just a little side note, they also used that same type of electroshock in a different sort of setting when they would, ask me a series of questions, and if I didn't answer the questions the way that they wanted, then they would use that as kind of a form of punishment.
How did the shock feel?
Horrible. I mean, I can't really even describe it.
So describe to me what it was that they put up your rectum.
It was kind of like a tube at first. I mean, is what it looked like.
Did they lubricate it before they put it up?
Yes.
Was it connected to something?
Yeah.
And how were they applying the shocks?
They were positioned a few feet away from me.
And give me an example of the kind of questions they would ask you.
When they were asking, questions, it was usually along the lines of things about talking to people, relaying information about what was going on down there. I do remember this occurred directly after that visit I had with the specialist, when I talked to the nurse about that.
So the electric shocks began when you asked questions about the tunnels?
Oh no, they had been going on before that. It was just the specific instance.
So I mean, I can imagine for a young child that was terrifying.
Yeah, I mean that was part of the reason I hadn't had a bowel movement for 2 weeks.
Have you suffered physical damage as a result of what they did to you?
Well, I did, actually. And that, thankfully, as horrible and as twisted as this sounds, the electroshock procedure left scars. And when I was about 37 years old, I went in for a procedure. I had internal hemorrhoids, prolapse issues, went in for surgery. Everything pretty much went as planned, except it was a longer surgery than they anticipated.
What did they tell you?
When I came back for the 2-week checkup, the post-op checkup, the doctor or the surgeon asked me if I'd ever had, or do I remember what procedure I had had. And I said, this is my first surgery. I've never had any other procedures. And he just kind of looked at me funny, and he said, well, the surgery was a little bit more complicated than we anticipated, because 85 to 90% of your rectum is scar tissue that looks like some of it was cauterized. And we had to rebuild your rectum out of tissue from your colon.
How many years did you go to this facility for?
I attended that pediatrician from birth all the way up till I was 16 years old. The window of time that I actually went to the facility was from approximately 4 years old to 9, 10 years old.
And I hope this isn't an intrusive question, because it's actually very pertinent to why they were doing it with you at such a young age. Do you have any rough idea about when you went through puberty?
Right about 12, I would say. 12,
yeah, so
right around
it's
there.
pretty much before you went through puberty, you were going to this clinic.
Right.
Passiamo ora a Jim Semivan, che in questo breve ma recentissimo spezzone racconta un dato particolarmente inquietante. Secondo quanto riferisce, 16 persone si sarebbero suicidate dopo un incontro con intelligenze non umane. Il punto centrale in questo caso è che il fenomeno viene presentato in una luce estremamente negativa.
We had lost 16 people through suicide based on the encounters they had.
In una lunga intervista condotta da Whitley Strieber, a sua volta noto per aver raccontato esperienze di rapimento e per avere una visione molto critica del fenomeno, Semivan torna finalmente sul suo celebre episodio personale. Fino ad oggi lo aveva descritto solo in termini generali come un evento che avrebbe danneggiato lui e sua moglie senza che fosse mai chiaro da chi né il motivo. Questa volta invece entra maggiormente nei dettagli, racconta che gli sarebbe stata praticata una biopsia e che dopo l'incontro sua moglie avrebbe avuto il ciclo per 3 settimane consecutive. Descrive inoltre l'aspetto dei presunti rapitori, un dettaglio particolarmente interessante perché in molte interviste precedenti aveva sempre affermato che si trattava di entità viste molto raramente, senza però spiegare con precisione di che tipo di entità si trattasse. In questa occasione le descrive come esseri molto simili all'omino Michelin, il cosiddetto Bibendum, una tipologia davvero insolita di cui si sente parlare molto raramente.
So I went to bed one night, my wife and I, and we don't have any children, and we lived in we lived in a house that was built in the 50s, but it was a nice spread out sort of 2-level on a half of an acre on an old Civil War encampment. And before that Civil War encampment, it was an Indian campground. And we went to bed normally do, and it was either Thursday or Friday, night. No, it was a Thursday night or a Wednesday night. I can't remember exactly what. And I woke up. I was laying on my back because I had a little hiatal hernia, so I had a little wedge pillow. So I'm laying on my back, and I went right to sleep like I always do. And the next thing you know, I open up my eyes, and there are these 3 beings at the foot of my bed. And I wasn't the least bit afraid. As a matter of fact, I was a little bewildered, and bewildered only in the sense that I didn't have a lot of movement, but I did have movement, and they had these little, I don't know, like a smile, but it wasn't really a smile because they had these real thin line for lips, and they didn't look like Grace. They looked like very angular faces, grayish brown, sort of greenish eyes, almond shaped, very, very tiny little triangle thing for a nose. I didn't notice any ears. It could have been slits there. But their mouth, I'll never forget, their mouth was sort of upturned just a little bit, like they were smiling at me. And but they had, it was interesting, and they had black body armor on their heads and from their neck all the way down. And by that, and they were later explained to me called bibendi, the plural for Bibendum, who was the Michelin tire man. That's how they described them, and people described them. And they, Colm Kelleher once, he's the one who sort of told me what he thought they were. And the hats were sort of like a triangle, and but just black round body armor on the head, and then from the neck all the way down on the arms. And I remember,
sounds like they didn't trust you very much.
Oh, yeah. And what I remember was me remembering that this is not a dream, and this is not a hypnagogic state. I was wide awake. And, but again, I wasn't afraid. But I remember looking over to see how my wife was. And you've met my wife, Debbie.
Yes, I have.
And there she was, sort of curled up in a fetal position in the bed, covers not on her, which was unusual. And I looked up, and they were there. And then all of a sudden, that ended. And then there was another, I don't know how to say it, is like the next thing you know, Debbie and I, and this entity, something very tall behind me, but I couldn't see its face, but it was tall. And I always had this feeling that he had his arm around both of us, but I'm not sure about that. But again, very real. But it was in black and white. The first part was in color, right? And Jacques Vallée explained to me this is not unusual because it has a cinematic effect sometimes to these kind of experiences. And the being was asking us or telling us, look up into the sky. And we were behind our house in a wooded area on a road, which is the road behind our house, Sharon Chapel Drive. Oh, that's what it was. And we were standing there and looking up, and there were these three orbs, two at the bottom, one at the top, in a triangular formation. And they're shimmering, and they're big. And I remember looking at them, and I remember looking at my wife, down at my wife, and saying, and please excuse my French, and I said, let's get the fuck out of here before they come back. I said that directly to her. And when I said that, I looked back up, and these three orbs merged into one and shot up through the sky. Then the third part of this was, because it was divided up into three parts, was me watching, again in black and white, my wife and I running to get back into the house. All right. And then after that, my eyes opened up. It was exactly 7 o'clock in the morning. I was, what the hell was that? The thing that shook me more than anything else was I knew what a lucid dream was. My wife's a clinical psychologist. We've talked about these things before, and so I knew what they were, and I had lucid dreams before, but this was nowhere near this. I got up, I was so animated, and for me, at 7 o'clock in the morning, I'm not animated. And I dragged myself. I was just beside myself. I didn't know what to think. And I got up, and I couldn't find Debbie, and then all of a sudden, I see the bathroom door ahead, and it was closed. So I got up and knocked on the door, and she opened it up, and I said, you don't believe what just happened. And she said, oh, please. She said, I'm not feeling really well. And I said, are you all right? And she was throwing water on her face and said, no, I am not. She said, something's really off. She said, I'm bleeding and I don't know what's going on. And she said, I never happened to me before, and I'm really don't feel well. So I said, okay, great. Let's get you to a doctor. And So she called her doctor, and we got her down there. And anyway, long story short, she was bleeding for about 17 straight days, and they could not figure out what had happened.
Bleeding where?
Uh, where women bleed,
Oh, I see.
yeah,
Okay, I understand.
yeah. So yeah. So and I didn't want to say vagina on your show, but I guess that's okay. Again, we're not putting two and two together. But while we were getting our clothes on to go to the doctor, she looked at me and she said something like, "What's on the back of your neck?" And I said, "What?" And she said, "It's all bloody. You have a hole back there." And we didn't focus on it too much. So we got her, took her to the doctor, brought her back home. And then I went into work, and I always wore, the same, uniform to work, which, because I used to meet with a lot of the private sector people and other government agencies. So I always had to wear a suit, and I was in a blue shirt or a white shirt, starched, heavily starched. And I went in there at the work, and I remember my neck feeling funny, and I thought it was just a starchy collar. But I ran into a buddy of mine who was working in what we would call a field office or a station in the D.C., Washington, D.C. area. And I was sending everybody home because I said, "It's look, Friday, this is go home, go home, go home, go home." And the young fellow that was there, I knew he had a doctorate. I knew he had written a couple of books. I didn't know his real name. He was a deep cover officer. And I asked him where he was going, and he said he was going to Virginia Beach to a UFO conference at the Edgar Cayce Institute. And I said, "Oh, can I tell you something what happened to me the other night?" And he goes, "Yeah." And I told him the story I told you. And then he's asking me if there's any kind of unusual marks on my body. And did it ever happen before? No, no unusual marks on my body. Any scoop marks? Nothing like that. Then he said, "What about your neck? What about your head?" And when he did that,
Wow.
I went like this, sort of. And I went, "Yeah, my neck hurts." And my wife said I have something back there, a pimple or something. And so he got out of his chair. He undid my tie and pulled my neck back, my collar back, and he says, "Your collar's all bloody. You have a hole in the back of your neck that's beginning to scab over, and it is the exact circumference of a pencil eraser." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah." And he gets up, he goes back to his seat, sits down, and he said, "You want me to tell you what I think happened?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I think you had an abduction experience." And I said, "Well, I wasn't familiar with that term. And I don't call it that because I call it an experience because I don't know in the end what it really was. But nevertheless, it had all the elements of it." And he asked me, he started telling me about it, explaining it to me. But then he had said something very, very odd out of the blue. He said, "Did your wife have any unexplained bleeding?" Just like that. That's when it hit me because, I don't mind you. I'm from Youngstown, Ohio, grew up, semi rough, but, I don't mind getting pushed around a little bit, what have you, manhandled, but don't touch my wife, I got really angry when I thought, okay, something came into my room. Something did something to me and my wife. I'm okay. She isn't. Not good. And ever since that time, I still consider it a human rights violation, and which makes me incredibly wary of this phenomenon or whatever the hell it was. And then it was about and there's a lot more to this, but we had we were going to a formal event. I don't know, maybe a year later, and we were late, and Debbie was in the bathroom, and I said, "Deb, we have to get going." And she said, "Well, something's in my face." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And she's hacking, right? It's really rather indelicate, and it was indelicate watching her hack. And she said, "Something's in my face," and she's holding her nose, and she has these Kleenex in her hand, and finally she hacks up through her nose, came out a little tiny piece of metal, perfectly square. Anyway, we didn't know what the hell that was. We saved it. And over the years, I used to show it to friends of ours who were doctors or nurses, and they had no clue. But it wasn't until John Alexander and I met in 2014 that he heard our story and he took it to Hal's lab, where he and Eric Davis looked at it much, much closer. And of course, it came out, we don't know. It's inconclusive. We don't know what it is. There's no marks on it or anything like that. Could be anything. But we couldn't find a commercial application for it. So we don't know what that was about. And that sort of, in 2014, that sort of started the whole process with me. But interestingly, when that happened, and I'll just end it after this, then I got contacted by some people. And first, Jacques Vallée came out to my house, which was very wonderful. He's such a wonderful man. And we spent the day together, all three of us. And he was very, very helpful. Then some people came into my house and had a little mobile lab with them, and they took my blood and my DNA and my wife's blood and DNA. They asked for our medical records, and I had been keeping our medical records since 1983, the year we got married, my wife and I. So I had a big stack of medical records for my wife and myself. So I handed them to him, just handed it to him. God, it was like a week or two later, my wife and I were just coming back from Toronto on a short trip, and we were at National Airport getting in our car, and I get a call from this guy, the doctor, and he goes, and he wasn't happy. He was very concerned about my neck, and they were trying to figure out, and what that could mean. And, there's no apparent scar there. But apparently he had found in my medical files an x-ray that was taken, a full frontal x-ray that was taken of my head and my mouth and my neck. It clearly showed what the doctor said was a puncture biopsy. And he said, "Why didn't you tell me you had a puncture biopsy?" And I said, "I never had a puncture biopsy." He said, "It's very clear that's what this is." And he said, "We put some, computer-assisted software on here. We were able to look at it. Somebody went in and took tissue, and you can see it very clearly. The little mark where the tissue was gone." What was interestingly is after that, we had always had poltergeist activity in our house. We lived in an old house built in 1954, like I said, on this old Civil War encampment and former Indian campgrounds.
As soon as you mentioned former Indian campgrounds, my cabin was on an Indian campground, and not far from it were the burial mounds of two medicine people.
Ooh.
And, these people, the Native Americans, often with their rituals and their deep understanding of what we earlier in the show referred to as the mystical, they do achieve a state of where they are at the bridge between the physical and non-physical worlds. And that lasts, that frequency lingers in the land forever. And that's probably what the poltergeists were about.
Was that, and particularly it was the footsteps. Always when we went to bed, I used to close the bedroom door. As soon as that bedroom door is closed and we were in bed, tap, 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 tap. And it would go on for a while. And then we had the incident with the cigarette smoke.
Fascinating, because I've gone deeply into why that is. Go ahead.
Well, we lived in a neighborhood. It was, we had a half-acre lot, and the lots around us were all wooden. They were far enough apart, and nobody in our neighborhood smoked cigarettes, and we didn't smoke cigarettes. But my wife used to travel a lot, and she used to come home, particularly when she came home. She would wake up in the middle of the night, and she would say, "Do you smell the cigarette smoke?" And I would wake up really groggy and go, "No." And I had my nose broken a dozen times when I was, growing up from all kinds of incidents. And so I said, "I don't smell anything." And then, she would go away, come back again, same thing, cigarette smoke. And then somebody sitting on my bed. And then after like the third or fourth time this went on, she woke me up again, and I sure as hell felt it. I felt that somebody was on our bed. And I also smelled the cigarette smoke for the first time. And that was sort of strange. So my wife decided that if we have a poltergeist or a spirit in the house, she was going to contact it with a friend of hers. They were very spiritually oriented, and they were going to basically say, "You're welcome to be here. It's
But don't
okay."
smoke.
Yeah, don't smoke. And yeah, she was traveling again, and I was in the yard, and I was doing some gardening in the front yard, and this fellow comes walking up the driveway, and he said, "Do you live here?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "Oh, my wife grew up in this house." And I said, "Really?" She said, "Yeah, yeah." And I said, "Oh, is your wife here?" And she said, "Well, she's walking around the back of your house." And then sure enough, she came up, and we were chatting, and I said, "Well, you want to see the inside of the house?" Because we had done some work. And she said, "Yeah." So I took him around, showed him the house, and in the master bedroom. And she said to me, "This is where my sister and I slept." And I said, "Oh." And I said to her, I said, "Did you ever smell cigarette smoke at night?" The look on her face. And then, and I explained to her, I said, my wife gets up. I said, particularly when she comes home, after a 3 or 4 day trip. And I said, somebody's sitting on the bed, somebody's stroking her hair, and there's heavy cigarette smoke. Well, she starts crying even more, and the husband grabs her, and I was, uh-oh, what did I start? Turns out her mother was a heavy smoker, and her mother used to come into that room every night, say goodnight to the girls, and would always rub her hand over their hair, and kiss them goodnight, and sometimes tell them a story. She said, "But there's always cigarette smoke in the house." And I said, "Well, if this is your mother," I said, "she's welcome. She's just welcome, and what have you." And anyway, little things like that would happen all the time around our house. So, but anyway, you were going to talk about cigarette smoke.
Yeah, because I've done quite a study of this phenomenon because it's quite prevalent. And I've learned a lot about it. First, the Native American community and the indigenous peoples of the Americas use tobacco specifically, not other drugs, but tobacco, to communicate with the world of the dead and with the spirit world. Now, in South America, they also use ayahuasca and so forth, but it's a different type of communication. This tobacco that they use is not what you buy in a store. This is really intense, very nicotine-rich tobacco, a whole different ball game from what you're used to in the stores. Now, when we were living in our cabin, it began to fill up with cigarette smoke, and we found places in the woods near the house where someone was standing and smoking hundreds and hundreds of cigarettes. And this was a hybrid. He followed us to Texas when we lost the cabin.
I remember
And
that story. Yeah.
yeah, and he smoked constantly, all the time. I don't think he even slept. He smoked all the time. The reason they smoke is that they are hearing the voices of everyone around them in their heads. They are fluently telepathic, unvoiced, and highly autistic. And the males, most of them have Klinefelter syndrome. I think it's called Klinefelter syndrome, yes, which is a chromosomal mismatch that causes them to reach puberty but never go through it, and they simply age as in a state of just at the edge of puberty. They just continue to grow older, and they look like, as I said when I first saw him, they look like weathered children. They're very odd looking. So they smoke for two reasons. One is the same reason schizophrenics smoke. Schizophrenics are hearing voices in their heads that are self-generated. And the nicotine causes that not to go away, but it smooths out the affect. It makes it more easy to endure. And these people, these hybrids, are constantly hearing the voices of others. I've had that happen to me a couple of times, and it's pretty awful. You definitely don't want to be telepathic if you can't control it, and I certainly cannot. And I don't think they can either. Okay, that's one reason they smoke. The other reason that they smoke has to do with communication. They can't communicate with each other telepathically unless they have nicotine in their systems, and I think probably in the air around them. I got into this with the Greys. I tried to get the Greys once, one of them, to come and stay with me for more than, I started out asking for 2 weeks, knowing I would be lucky to get 30 seconds. I got about 15 seconds, during which time she showed me a tiny cigarette. And this cigarette was remarkable. It was just about this big. And I wasn't going to talk about this on the air, but I've changed my mind, obviously. And it was written on it in what looked like pen were the most intricate hieroglyphics you could ever see. And I found out that they smoke constantly here because in their world where they're from physically, there is something in the atmosphere that works like nicotine, and maybe it is something in I don't know what it is, but it facilitates telepathy, and they use this for telepathy as we use it and used it for communication between the living and the dead. So it's a remarkable drug, whatever it is. And the hybrids that I know in upstate New York are much nicer than the ones out here in California, by the way. I'm not saying anything bad about them. They're sweet, but they're very good to me in many ways, and I respect them, and I'm very grateful they're in my life. But they want me to smoke because they say that, you can be in our telepathic community if you smoke. And I don't want to smoke. I said, well, why don't you vape? I don't want to vape either. I'm not going to do it. And I don't necessarily want to be in a telepathic community because I've been in telepathy a few times. Community with the Greys and the hybrids is another story. And I'm not sure that if I couldn't get out of it, I wouldn't have a lot of trouble enduring it. And I love them very much. They're very much a part of my life. The Greys are not dangerous so much as they are really different, and they want things from us that we don't fully understand, and it's scary.
Yeah.
But we'll get used to them eventually. Okay. So all of that said, that's why I wanted to bring up cigarette smoke, because it's something that's important in this whole thing, and people need to know when you smell that in your house and there's no one smoking, that's because this is happening to you.
And I've been studying this for 40 years. When I was briefed on topics, not so much UAP, but phenomenology, in a classified setting, about what the government had done and has been doing and what the results were, the veil got lifted, and I was really upset, and I was upset for a while, and it took me a while to get used to it. It's sort of like you. I mean, the experiences you have been going through now, not just your initial experience, but once you have gone through it too, there's a familiarity to it that you become accustomed to. But at the same time, there's a wariness that never quite leaves. Where like with a guy like Chris Bledsoe, he doesn't seem to have, he sees it in a much more spiritual context than I do, in a very positive spiritual context, which I think is wonderful for him. I'm not quite there. I'm not quite there yet. I'm not.
Neither am I. But he has faith, and he has joy. And Anne used to say, Whitley, if you want to do this, you have to have joy. You have to bring your joy to the experience, and the experience will respect it. And she's right. She's absolutely right about that.
That's
and
a nice
Chris
way to
does
look at
that instinctively because of who he is and what he is.
Per approfondire abbiamo contattato anche l'autorevole e sempre disponibile Edoardo Russo del CISO, che ci ha confermato come si tratti effettivamente di incontri molto rari. Russo ci ha inoltre fornito 2 PDF, tra cui un numero della rivista Clipeus del 1978, dove veniva presentato un caso spagnolo del 76. Ci ha anche segnalato l'esistenza di almeno altri 3 casi, uno francese e addirittura 2 italiani. La rivista Clipeus collega diversi casi simili, ma l'episodio centrale è quello avvenuto il 12 novembre 76 presso la base aerea spagnola di Talavera la Real, vicino a Badajoz. Secondo il resoconto, 3 soldati di guardia avrebbero percepito interferenze audio, fischi acuti, luci anomale e il comportamento terrorizzato del cane da guardia. Poco dopo sarebbe apparsa una figura umanoide verdastra, alta circa 3 metri, con testa piccola, corpo massiccio, braccia lunghe e gambe poco distinguibili. Uno dei soldati, Trejo, tentò di sparare, ma raccontò di essersi sentito paralizzato, di essere caduto a terra e di aver perso temporaneamente la vista. Gli altri militari riferiscono di aver visto la figura e di aver sparato numerosi colpi. L'essere sarebbe poi scomparso improvvisamente, come una televisione che si spegne. In seguito la base fu perlustrata, ma non vennero trovate tracce decisive. La rivista collega questo episodio ad altri casi: un precedente avvistamento sempre presso Talavera, un caso avvenuto a Istrana nel Veneto nel 73 e un altro episodio spagnolo del 76, nel quale i testimoni descrissero esplicitamente l'essere come simile all'omino della Michelin. Il Bibendum sembra quindi rappresentare una tipologia rara ma ricorrente nell'ufologia: un umanoide alto, gonfio, talvolta luminoso, con gambe poco visibili, spesso associato a contesti militari, fischi, vortici, paralisi o effetti fisici sui testimoni. Poiché questi eventi sono molto rari, abbiamo deciso di contattare anche Jacques Vallée, che consideriamo non solo una delle figure più autorevoli nello studio del fenomeno, ma anche una delle 50 persone che sanno cosa sta succedendo e che guidano la disclosure. Gli abbiamo chiesto che cosa pensasse dei Bibendum, soprattutto in rapporto alla disclosure americana, che oggi sembra invece concentrarsi quasi sempre su figure ormai ricorrenti, come rettiliani, grigi, nordici e mantidi. Vallée ci ha risposto brevemente, ma in modo molto interessante. Mi sono interrogato a lungo su questo tema. Le dichiarazioni attuali sull'aspetto degli esseri UFO, rettiliani, umanoidi, nani e insettoidi, possono anche sembrare coerenti, ma provengono dalle stesse fonti segrete, tra virgolette, che negli ultimi 50 anni non hanno mai fornito un racconto lineare, documentato e verificabile. I testimoni diretti, al contrario, raccontano molte altre forme, inclusi il robot. Dunque, o l'aspetto è una caratteristica opzionale, nel senso che questi essi prendono semplicemente in prestito una forma dalla nostra immaginazione e si presentano attraverso di essa, oppure è una caratteristica scelta di volta in volta per adattarsi alla situazione. Ho soltanto osservato che il Bibendum potrebbe essere una forma immaginata nei primi anni del programma spaziale, quando i nostri astronauti iniziarono a indossare scafandri molto voluminosi. Tuttavia questa figura compare in molti contesti e in molti luoghi diversi. La risposta di Vallée è importante perché rimane coerente con una delle sue ipotesi centrali. Il fenomeno potrebbe non mostrarsi nella sua vera forma, ma utilizzare immagini, archetipi, icone culturali per rappresentarsi agli esseri umani. Un argomento che abbiamo già parlato più e più volte. In altre parole, il Bibendum non sarebbe necessariamente la vera forma di queste entità, ma una possibile maschera, una rappresentazione simbolica o un'immagine adattata al contesto storico, culturale e psicologico del testimone. Passiamo ora ad una recentissima intervista di Louis Elizondo, nella quale vengono affrontati temi estremamente delicati. Uno dei punti centrali è l'ipotesi dei MILABs, cioè dei presunti rapimenti o esperienze attribuite inizialmente a entità non umane, ma che potrebbero invece implicare anche il coinvolgimento militare o governativo. Nel corso dell'intervista viene evocata la possibilità di un accordo segreto tra ambienti militari, apparati governativi e intelligenze non umane. Secondo questa ipotesi, in cambio di tecnologia, conoscenze o forme di cooperazione, alcune entità avrebbero ottenuto accesso a materiale biologico umano o addirittura a persone. Si parla anche di antigravità e del caso di Amy Eskridge, una scienziata di grande talento, scomparsa di recente, nota per essere una figura tormentata, forse segnata da una possibile dipendenza dall'alcol. Secondo il racconto, Eskridge avrebbe subito pressioni o minacce da ambienti legati ai contractor della difesa. Il tema centrale quindi è il coinvolgimento degli apparati militari e di intelligence in una relazione molto più profonda del previsto e diretta con le intelligenze non umane. Non si tratterebbe soltanto di osservare, studiare e recuperare UAP, ma di possibili accordi, scambi e concessioni. Tra questi, il punto più inquietante riguarda l'eventuale accesso al nostro DNA, che sembrerebbe possedere caratteristiche particolari o comunque preziose per qualcuno. Da un lato sembra emergere una visione apparentemente positiva o cooperativa, una sorta di alleanza tra esseri umani ed NHI. Dall'altro lato, però, anche qualora una collaborazione di questo tipo esistesse davvero, non potrebbe in alcun modo giustificare violenze, rapimenti o esperimenti condotti senza consenso. Un altro elemento fondamentale di cui abbiamo già parlato nell'episodio 95 è l'idea che in futuro possa manifestarsi un pericolo per il pianeta Terra, una minaccia che non riguarderebbe soltanto l'umanità, ma anche le stesse intelligenze non umane. In questa prospettiva, l'eventuale alleanza tra apparati terrestri ed NHI potrebbe essere nata proprio per affrontare un rischio comune. Questo tema sembra emergere anche nell'ultima intervista di Amy Eskridge. Il nostro punto di vista appare quindi coerente sia con quanto afferma Louis Elizondo, sia con alcune intuizioni attribuite a Eskridge. Il fenomeno non sarebbe soltanto una questione tecnologica, militare o di intelligence, ma potrebbe riguardare il futuro stesso della Terra e della nostra specie. Tra questi, il punto più inquietante riguarda l'eventuale accesso al nostro DNA, che sembrerebbe possedere caratteristiche particolari o comunque preziose per qualcuno. Da un lato sembra emergere una visione apparentemente positiva o cooperativa, una sorta di alleanza tra esseri umani ed NHI. Dall'altro lato, però, anche qualora una collaborazione di questo tipo esistesse davvero, non potrebbe in alcun modo giustificare violenze, rapimenti o esperimenti condotti senza consenso. Un altro elemento fondamentale di cui abbiamo già parlato nell'episodio 95 è l'idea che in futuro possa manifestarsi un pericolo per il pianeta Terra, una minaccia che non riguarderebbe soltanto l'umanità, ma anche le stesse intelligenze non umane. In questa prospettiva, l'eventuale alleanza tra apparati terrestri ed NHI potrebbe essere nata proprio per affrontare un rischio comune. Questo tema sembra emergere anche nell'ultima intervista di Amy Eskridge. Il nostro punto di vista appare quindi coerente sia con quanto afferma Louis Elizondo, sia con alcune intuizioni attribuite a Eskridge. Il fenomeno non sarebbe soltanto una questione tecnologica, militare o di intelligence, ma potrebbe riguardare il futuro stesso della Terra e della nostra specie.
At ATIP, I was a nuts and bolts kind of guy, so really airframe, air integrity, the material science and propulsion behind the vehicles themselves, not so much the occupants. But what Gates is referring to is something called, in the vernacular, it's known throughout kind of the UFO community as MyLabs. And what it suggests is that there's been a long-standing agreement or understanding between us and our friends from out of town that have allowed us to work with whatever these are, in a cooperative agreement, and in exchange for that, supposedly they would have access to certain human specimens biologically in order to test. I have to say, first and foremost, I heard about that while I was at the Pentagon. I was not privy to the specifics of that. From my understanding, that relationship began, if it is true, began sometime in the 1950s, and has continued. I have met several individuals, former intelligence officers for the Air Force and other services, who swear by it, who actually say they've had encounters with UAP and have seen military personnel in and around the vehicles. There are cases which seem rather interesting, where you have, in some cases, UAP potentially being escorted by American fighter jets and allied fighter jets. So that would give you some sense of cooperation, maybe between us and whatever they are. But I don't have firsthand knowledge of that, of hybridization or forced hybridization. And if that is the case, then I think Representative Burchett is absolutely correct, because if it's true that there's a scenario where we have elements of the American government wittingly cooperating with something else and allowing human beings to be against their own will, right, be taken. Well, from my perspective, when I was a special agent, that's called kidnapping, right? That's a felony offense. And then if they are touched in any way, right, that's called assault, right? So there's a lot of issues here that legally, fundamentally, I think we would have a problem with. Then you have the other information that I know Representative Burchett has had access to, along with some of his other colleagues like Luna and Burleson. That could be very disturbing, because it shows that maybe we have been a little bit more complicit with this topic than we have previously stated. Keep in mind, we spent decades saying nothing to see here, folks. It's not real. This is not, this is silly. Turns out we were spending a lot of taxpayer money, a lot of your money, actually, researching this topic, and I was part of that effort, and so were many of my colleagues. And it turns out that, there are things that go bump in the night, and that can be very disturbing for some people, especially from a philosophical perspective or a theological perspective, and even a psychological perspective.
Okay, so two things jump out at me right away that make me struggle with this. Number one, genetically, how in the world could you possibly sync up humanity and whatever this non-intelligence may be? It'd be like crossbreeding us with a dog, I imagine. And a dog has evolved on Earth. It doesn't make sense, Lou. How would that even be possible?
No, that's a great question. In fact, we've already done it before with other things. We've actually crossbred rats and their DNA with jellyfish, and now these rats glow. There's bioluminescence. Imagine that, a glowing rat, right, or a glowing sheep. So we've already done that, actually. From a scientific perspective, it's not that hard. And frankly, when you look at the genetics, I think we share something like 90% of our DNA with a banana, right? So it's not really that far off. We are already crossbreeding to bring animals back from extinction, like the dire wolf. Right. So we are well beyond that. Can we take DNA from something else and mix it with human DNA? Yes, it can be done. We've already done it with animals, and that's common knowledge. Anybody can get on a search engine and type in, glow in the dark rats or glow in the dark sheep, and you will see where we have crossbred jellyfish DNA with mammalian DNA. And I suspect in China, they've gone much, much further than that. There are ethical issues with it, but I think scientifically, when you're saying how do we crossbreed, it can be done. And I'll also suggest something else very interesting you said, because Jillian, I think it's a really important question you're asking here. How can you take DNA that is terrestrial here from Earth, and fine, you can argue the fact that maybe jellyfish are from Earth, and so therefore there's some similarity with something completely not human. But we don't know that. It is possible that there is some sort of linkage there, maybe either in our distant history, in our past, where these things are not so dissimilar. Look, they've been reported for having bilateral symmetry, having two arms, two legs, very similar to humanoid type morphology. That suggests a lot of things. Either A, the human form is very, very common in the cosmos, or B, that there's a common link somewhere between human beings and potentially higher primates and whoever these are. And if you go down that logic trail, then you have to ask a question that maybe our friends from out of town aren't really from outer space at all. Maybe they're from right here. Maybe they are from under our oceans. Maybe these things are just as natural to Earth as we are, but we're now at the point technologically where we can actually begin to interact with them. So,
why in the world would our government cooperate with kidnapping humans? Okay, so Lou, I'm just walking through how crazy this is, right? When these non-human intelligence creatures have arguably been just abducting people for hundreds of years. And arguably, in one of the books, I guess, that they left out of the Bible, the book of Ezekiel, they talk about lights in the sky and getting in chariots and going up into the stars. Why would we even need to cooperate with this? It doesn't even make sense. They could just grab one of us and go.
Sure. Well, if these things are truly intelligent and not just automatons, then one can surmise that there might be some sort of social structure there, meaning some sort of cooperation. And why I say that is because if you look at all higher primates in the animal kingdom, if you want a species to survive, you have to learn how to cooperate as a unit, as a group, right? So whether it's a tribe, it's a village, it's a city, it's a country, it's a nation, it doesn't matter. Cooperation is really important for the survival of a species from a macro perspective, not a micro perspective, but a macro perspective. So it is possible that the idea of cooperation isn't just a terrestrial thing, that it is a universal kind of like perhaps other things we see, like the behavior of light, for example. It's just a matter of physics. It's possible that in order for any type of intelligent being to really evolve itself, cooperation amongst themselves and amongst others is imperative, because there's been speculation that perhaps these things don't necessarily want to clone and hybrid and look like us and be like us and act like us, thank God. But perhaps it's that they've lacked something as a perhaps reproductive capability, right? So they're looking at, okay, well, humans are very prolific. They obviously know how to reproduce. Maybe there's something in human DNA that allows us to find that way where we can now, reproduce again. Perhaps they've lost their ability to reproduce. We simply don't know. And again, this is mere speculation here. So let me just put this out there, that right now, these are just, if you were to go down the scientific avenue of why something would want to crossbreed with human beings, we are a very adaptive creature. We can live on virtually all 7 continents on this planet. We can swim, we can run, we can crawl, and we do a lot of things pretty well. We do have an incredible ability to adapt, and maybe there's something there that's interesting or enticing to something that is definitively not human, and say, hey, these little furry monkeys over here have found a way to do certain things that we can't. Maybe there's something there that we want to look into. There's a whole bunch of reasons. Why do we study right now genetically cows? We do it all the time, right?
She was being harassed, as mentioned, by defense contractors, and she explicitly said, if you see any report that I killed myself, I most definitely did not. Guys, can we throw up SOT 3, please? 3.
The ultra-terrestrials, I think, have you heard of the P-52s and the P-47s? Do you know what that is? They're us from the future. They're from here. They are you. They are me. They're from here, from the future. P-47 is present plus 47,000 years. P-52 is present plus 52,000 years. And basically there's a calamity, right? So there's like a apocalypse scenario in the near future. It wipes out most of like everything, man. And there's the ones that go underground and survive, right? And then there's the ones that somehow stay on the surface and miraculously don't die.
Okay, so obviously, as mentioned, when I saw this, I was like, oh, she's mentally ill. Only to learn, by the way, maybe she is. She seems drunk. I think it's confirmed that she is drunk in that video, but she also happens to be a legitimate genius who was legitimately working on anti-gravity technology, legitimately said, if I turn up dead, I did not delete myself, something's wrong. So Lou, who is this woman? And what do you think about what she just said?
Well, I had the privilege of meeting Amy Eskridge years ago when she was in Huntsville, Alabama. It is true that she has a deep science background. It is true that her and her father were absolutely convinced. I had dinner with them, in fact, with a group of other individuals back in 2018, I believe, in Huntsville, what you call Rocket City. And we'll talk a little bit about that, why Huntsville is so important. And she had indicated to myself and other members of ATIP that they had succeeded in creating an anti-gravity device and could actually demonstrate it and show it. And she was very concerned for her safety and well-being. And she said that she has been that is true. What she said about being harassed is something she conveyed to me as well. And it is possible that individuals were suffering the consequences of it. The reason why when you say you saw her hands and they looked red, while I was at the Pentagon, we actually had a study, and we had medical doctors and even surgeons that were assigned to our program that were trying to understand the symptoms of when you got too close to directed energy, and in this particular case, a UFO, because a lot of the pilots that were reporting a near encounter with a UFO would come back and it looked like they had sunburn. Right, their skin was red and it was a little bit blotchy. And it turns out that is very consistent with superficial radiation poisoning, just like a sunburn. You get too close and you get too much UV light on your skin, and what happens? Your skin gets red, and you burn. So if Amy was a victim to some sort of directed energy, you could potentially see that reddening of skin, and then even more, you'd have the consequences of internal organ damage and eventually organ failure. Because what happens, it starts with the skin, but if that energy is energetic enough and it's being directed at you, it actually goes inside your body and gets absorbed by your major organs. And again, they do not do well with radiation. Amy was very convinced that her and her father, and this is what I can tell you, her and her father were absolutely convinced that they had perfected and could demonstrate and test anti-gravitics.
Question: if I could see into the future, Lou, I'm getting lottery numbers. Do you know what I mean? That's it. I'm getting lottery numbers and I'm buying an island and I am checking out of this crazy shit. So, like, why is nobody, I'm not hearing about people that guessed every lottery number every week. Like, that's what I would do. I would say, okay, I'm going to look into the super lottery tomorrow.
I would love for you to talk to one of my former colleagues, Dr. Hal Puthoff, one of the godfathers, if you will, of the remote viewing program, Stargate and Grill Flame and whatnot. They did exactly that. Their budget was getting cut, so they decided for a month to play the stock market. And you know what? They made $2 million. But there is this weird rule with karma that if you try to use it for self-gain, and I don't know why this happens, it's like the laws of the universe are against you. But if you use it for self-gain, it winds up always something backfiring, and it winds up being worse for you. I don't think anybody has a right to withhold the truth from the American people. And that's exactly what's happened for many, many decades. And this is why this problem is so difficult right now to handle, because we spent decades telling American people one thing only to come back and say, oh yeah, by the way, funny, haha, we just joking, just kidding. This is all real. And by the way, now you can trust us to, tell you the truth moving forward. Okay, how does that work?
Okay.